Nowadays, whenever you say the word blockbuster, people usually picture But let's face it, for better or for worse, these money suckers have become the backbone of Hollywood. With the invention of the television and the recent rise of online streaming services, people are feeling less and less inclined to go to the movies. As a result, Hollywood should be losing money. A lot of money. And they are, but every now and then, a studio releases a stupidly calculated, formulaic, and extremely CGI-heavy film that they somehow time and time again convince people to go and see. And this is probably why Hollywood is standing after so many years. Granted, Hollywood is still losing a lot of money, but it's still alive, and all of it. Every movie that comes out and every frame that's been projected in the past 50 years has one movie to thank for it all. In the year 1968, Stanley Kubrik released perhaps one of the greatest movies ever made, and the film industry has never been the same because of it. First of all, you can't talk about blockbusters without also talking about CGI, because the two usually go hand in hand. CGI, or computer-generated images, like most things, has its pros and its cons. For one thing, it can be a lot cheaper and a lot easier. If you told someone to make a low-budget independent sci-fi film like Ex Machina 30 years ago, with very fine and intricate moving parts inside of a human head, the result would probably be something a lot more unrealistic or expensive. The thing is with CGI is when big producers tell VFX artists to build huge cities with a numerous amount of moving parts on a very strict and rapidly approaching deadline, they often don't have the time to fine-tune every effect, which is why it only looks good when it's used minimally.
Now when Zod came down, that was Michael Shannon's first day on set. He and I had talked and he had asked me whether or not he was gonna have armor on in the movie, and I said, of course you can have real armor in the movie. How else would we do it? And he was like, oh great, because I don't want to look like an idiot in the pajamas. And of course, he shows up in his pajama suit, and I'm like, yeah, sorry, it's gonna be CG armor. So he was not happy, and then he goes, where's the spaceship? I'm like, well, those green stairs are the spaceship.
On my films, I try to shoot as much in camera as possible. On Interstellar, my last film, for example, we didn't use any green screens. So when we were shooting inside a spaceship, we had views outside the windows. We produced all that material and we shot it and achieved the effect in camera. And when you're asked...
Even the bit where Matthew McConaughey's tumbling through a sort of space-time continuum, if that indeed is what he's doing.
Indeed. We built a set for that and we enhanced it with visual effects. And visual effects technology has been wonderful for enhancing those things and increasing the vocabulary. Trying to do these things for real, trying to use real locations. I've always preferred real locations to sets for the same reason. There's a feeling of reality, there's a feeling of being somewhere that matters.
But anyways, big blockbuster films pretty much have a bottomless pit of resources, so they have the money to do pretty much whatever they want using practical effects, which when done right can look completely flawless. It's something about how light bounces off actual objects that lets us know for a fact that it's real, therefore raising the stakes and giving us a better movie watching experience. But anyways, I don't want to wax lyrical about how once upon a time 100 years ago, practical effects were all that filmmakers needed, and there shouldn't be another way to do it, because some people don't have the budget to do everything in camera. But now they have another way, and that's all thanks to 2001. Prior to the film's release, practical effects were often shied away from. Filmmakers didn't feel comfortable filming something that didn't exist. And you can't blame them because back then you could spot practical effects a mile away. So they restricted themselves to small things like muzzle flashes and blood splatter. And it worked really well for those things. But that meant that there were a lot of stories that they thought they couldn't properly tell. So when Kubrick released 2001, people started to change the way they made films. For obvious reasons, he couldn't actually film in space, and there weren't any good methods of faking it, so he had to come up with his own. He invented a new technology that allowed him to seamlessly project images to the background of his subject, and in essence put them in a world where they could never really be in. He could have easily just put a projector behind a backdrop and just run with it like everyone else, but it looked like crap, and he had the budget. So he put the projector next to the camera and used a two-way mirror to film it. This is called front projection. He also used miniatures to film what would have been impossible to actually shoot. I'm not just saying in the background, he had the balls to put it right in front of the camera and the results speak for themselves. To film the characters in space, he used clay models and put them in place, took a picture, moved them a little bit, and took another. He did this at least 24 times per second on screen. So yeah, he invented stop motion picture, which has become a staple for animated films. To simulate the inside of a spaceship, he built an entire revolving set that the actors would walk inside. This method has also been used countless times since. To simulate stars and space effects, he had an artist experiment with different liquids, inks, and paints, and it all looks way better than the CGI of today, which is saying a lot. So because of this film, filmmakers no longer felt as nervous about shooting in space. You might be thinking, oh, that's cool, but not every film is shot in space, which is true. But if it weren't for 2001, many other innovational films that followed wouldn't have been possible. And there's one film that I'm talking about in particular. Less than 10 years later, in 1977, George Lucas released the first of many Star Wars films, and he too changed the film industry. Fast forward about 5 years after 2001, to a young George Lucas, fresh off the minor success of his first feature, American Graffiti. Lucas set out to direct the space epic, which he hoped would put a fresh new look on sci-fi films. But there was one problem. Nobody wanted to pay for it. Producers didn't want to give a whole lot of money to a kid to make a movie that was so weird and so crazy that they thought nobody would want to watch. So he took it upon himself to find a way to do it with a tiny budget. And how did he do that? Well, he used the exact same techniques that Kubrick used. From the miniatures to the dual projection, almost all the special effects in Star Wars were used in 2001, which therefore means that Star Wars could not exist without the effects that Kubrick invented for 2001. Keep in mind that Star Wars was the first film that people would wait in line to see. It was the first film with a young, hip fan base, and all that started with 2001. Steven Spielberg also used a lot of these techniques to shoot his films, especially in E.T. Fast forward 10 or 15 years to when George Lucas and Steven Spielberg started trying to create a new form of visual effects. One that they wouldn't have had the opportunity to design had it not been for their fame and success that they gained through telling such impossible stories. This technique was CGI. No, it wasn't perfect, and yes, it looked terrible, but the idea was that over time it would evolve and look more realistic, which it does when it isn't abused. But the point is that none of this would exist without Oddly enough, that isn't really why many consider it to be one of the greatest films of all time. 2001 is known for being both profound and timeless. The film in a nutshell is about the evolution of man, as demonstrated by one of the most famous cuts of all time. The film is also praised for being so forward-thinking. In 1968, Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke, the writer of the novelization, attempted to predict what the future might look like. And although there isn't yet a commercial space trip as shown in the film, they did successfully predict things like Wi-Fi, iPads, microwaves, possibly even satellites, Skype, Siri and AI, digital piloting systems, the list goes on. The film starts with the famous Dawn of Man sequence, depicting, as the title says, the very beginning of human intelligence, when man discovers tool, and uses tool to gather food and protection from other organisms. Jump forward to the year 2001, when we create what is essentially a tool, which becomes in itself so intelligent that it outsmarts us and actually kills us. But the film is also about man's place in the universe. We start in the Stone Age, when man was in the lower portion of the food chain, since we mostly only ate vegetation and what we found around us. and we're being hunted by creatures with big sharp teeth and who are much faster than us. Then through intelligence, we managed to put ourselves at the top, making ourselves the superior race, and seeing ourselves as the center of the universe. But that all changes when we realize that an unknown species was developed enough to plant an object on our moon 4 million years before we even made it to our moon, which means that we are no longer the superior race in the universe. Kubrik describes this species as beings of a godlike power who have transcended matter and who are now creatures of pure energy. But this comes full circle when man is reborn and it also becomes a creature of pure energy that is so intelligent that it knows it's in a movie and therefore looks directly at the audience, or at least that's my interpretation. Even though 2001 is one of the most beautiful films ever made, anyone who's seen it would agree that it is excruciatingly slow paced, so much so that it takes you out of the movie. I mean, there are like 5-minute shots of just a ship landing really slowly, and sometimes it's just a black screen with some music. Not to mention the long pauses in between dialogue. And there's one scene where we're literally just watching the two characters on the ship just sitting down and eating while watching themselves on the news. Now the reason why Kubrick did this is because he knew that this entire movie would be a little too much for people at the time. In order for them to really grasp onto what they were watching, they needed this time. But the world has changed and movies have become more like 2001. Our brains have now become more accustomed to this type of madness. Now Kubrick understood that the single most important function of a film is to entertain. And in my experience, this film doesn't really do that for people anymore. Which is a shame because this is such a great film, but it's typically only enjoyed by film buffs because everyone gets so bored so easily. Surely if Kubrick were here today, he would do something about it. But unfortunately that's not the case, which is why I took it upon myself to re-edit the film. I took the original, chopped it up shot by shot, and began to edit. I shortened some shots, rearranged some others, and even added some David Bowie rock and roll, so that this...
3 of the 5 men were put aboard asleep, or to be more precise, in a state of hibernation. They were Dr. Charles Hunter, Dr. Jack Kimball, and Dr. Victor Kaminsky. We spoke with Mission Commander Dr. David Bowman and his deputy, Dr. Frank Poole. Well, good afternoon, gentlemen. How's everything going?
Marvelous. Have no...
is now this.
I'm an alligator. I'm a mama, papa coming for you. I'm a space invader. I'll be a rock and rollin' bitch for you. Keep your mouth shut. Just walking like a big monkey bird. And I'm busting up a brain for the world. Keep your electric on, baby. With your ray gun smile.
3 weeks ago, the American spacecraft Discovery 1 left on its half-billion-mile voyage to Jupiter. This marks the first manned attempt to reach this distant planet. Earlier this afternoon, the World Tonight recorded an interview with the crew of Discovery at a distance of 80 million miles from Earth.
Hal, you have an enormous responsibility on this mission. In many ways, perhaps the greatest responsibility of any single mission element. You're the brain and central nervous system of the ship, and your responsibilities include watching over the men in hibernation. Does this ever cause you any lack of confidence?
Let me put it this way, Mr. Raymer. The 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made. No 9000 computer has ever made a mistake or distorted information. We are all, by any practical definition of the words, foolproof and incapable of error.
Hal, despite your enormous intellect, are you ever frustrated by your dependence on people to carry out actions?
Not in the slightest bit. I enjoy working with people. I have a stimulating relationship with Dr. Poole and Dr. Bowman. My mission responsibilities range over the entire operation of the ship, so I am constantly occupied. I am putting myself to the fullest possible use, which is all I think that any conscious entity can ever hope to do.
And just to give it a slightly fresher look, I added some color correction that made everything pop. Now I want to make it clear, I am not attempting to illegally post a film online for free, even though it's already been taken down 3 times for copyright strikes. This is not the original film, nor do I want to make money off of somebody else's work, which is why you can watch my version on Vimeo for free. I didn't make this for some extra cash on the side. I made this out of respect for the man and his work. I just wish that more people made films like he did. I wish that these big studios would realize that they don't necessarily need to spend all this money on big, stupid, meaningless movies to get people to watch them. Actually, I think that's why less and less people are going to cinemas. I wish they would realize that all people wanted to see is a good movie. So they should just focus on that, and people would start to take more chances on movies.
Picasso had a saying, he said, good artists copy, great artists steal.
Ground control to Major Tom. Ground control to Major Tom. Take your protein pills and put your helmet on. Ground control to Major Tom. 8, 7, 6. Commencing countdown, engines on. 3, 2. Check ignition and may God's love be with you. This is ground control to Major Tom. You've really made the grade, and the papers want to know whose shirts you wear. Now it's time to leave the capsule if you dare. This is Major Tom to ground control. I'm stepping through the door, and I'm floating in a most peculiar way, and the stars look very different today. For here am I sitting in a tin can. For